you've really got to have a dramatic transformation of your domestic market arrangements in order to be able to drive growth through your own. I mean, in India, for example, some extraordinary percentage, it's slipping my mind at the moment, but certainly over 60% of India's GDP growth has come from Indians making and providing goods and services to other Indians. They've been essentially relatively less touched by what's happening in the external sector, which is the opposite of China's situation. And this is why, in some ways, China has a little more to worry about in the short term. We still haven't got to the politics of it, because if you have unemployed people, and already there's the demography we haven't discussed, where one Chinese man is supporting 4 grandparents. You don't have an efficient state social safety net. If that one person supporting 4 grandparents becomes unemployed, what's going to happen in China? And if that's multiplied by a few tens of millions, will you have unrest the system is able to cope with without that pressure cooker valve?
Well, there have been 2 drivers of Chinese growth hitherto. One is investment, 45% even during the stimulus period, and the other has been exports. Now, they're bringing the investment rate down now because it's too high. Because the problem with having such a high investment rate is, one, contributing to corporate indebtedness, and secondly, undermining labor and capital productivity. So they need to bring that down, and they are bringing that down. Secondly, the other driver, as you say, Shashi, is exports. Now, prior to the financial crisis, exports accounted for 35% of Chinese GDP. It's now roughly 24%. And I think that this is probably, I don't know whether it will stay like this, but it certainly won't go back up to what it was before. And it's undesirable for all sorts of reasons for it to go back and forth. So the Chinese need to have new drivers for their growth. And the new drivers have to come from the new sources of technology and production. So, for example, and you're wrong, by the way, about the Chinese not being innovative. In lots of areas, they've become extremely innovative. And
examples?
Well, for example, in the internet. I mean, Alibaba is a very advanced expression. I mean, Alibaba is bigger than Amazon and eBay put together.
But it's
last year,
the others aren't allowed to compete.
I was going to say.
Well,
what about the 40,000 cyber police employed by the Chinese?
Alibaba is not a state company.
Internet is not exactly a free field.
Alibaba is a private company.
No, but
and Baidu is a private company.
The internet.
I mean, you're saying there are no new sources of growth. These are the new sources of growth. 10% of Chinese retail last year was on the internet, and it's rising at 40% a year. So, and in many ways, in many respects, in the big cities and so on, China is extremely wired up, largest internet population in the world. So the question for the Chinese now is to find and develop these new drivers of growth. And I think that in terms of the structural shift, the early signs are promising, but it is at very early stages still. The signs in terms of increasing consumption are not so encouraging. For that, as you said earlier, they need to develop a much better safety net so people feel more confident in the future and less that they need to save the money themselves. Now, the other question you were going to pushing me to answer was, well, what's going to happen politically?
Yes, let's finally get to that. Okay, yeah.
Now, I think that as far as one can see at the moment, the position of the Chinese Communist Party is very strong. Why? I mean, it's like governance in any part of the world. The Chinese Communist Party has presided over the greatest economic transformation in modern history and in human history. A most extraordinary change. People's lives and living standards right across China have been utterly transformed. So for that, the Chinese Communist Party enjoys the support and the legitimacy of any political organization which presides over that kind of transformation. Now, 10 years down the road, maybe it won't look the same. Maybe they'll get into trouble over this transition. Maybe they will. Maybe it'll only be, half successful. Or and maybe the living standards will be affected. Maybe, at the moment last year they created 11 million jobs. So they can still, so unemployment is very low in China. But maybe they'll run into more difficulty. I mean, I don't know. I haven't got a crystal ball. But I certainly recognize these changes are very difficult. But for the foreseeable future, the Chinese Communist Party, I think, is very secure.
How far is the foreseeable
And
future?
I'll say something else, and that is, political stability in China is not just an interest of the Chinese. It's also a global interest. What interest have we got in mass political instability and potential implosion in China? The impact of that globally would be far, far greater than what happened in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Why? Because China is now the second largest economy in the world, and the fallout from things going wrong on an extremely large scale would be disastrous globally.
Let's be blunt. What you're talking about is if and when Xi Jinping does not have the military, the PLA, under his heel as he has done now, has been able to do by now.
I think that, let's say, I mean, what's a scenario? A scenario would be growing dissatisfaction, growing instability, large demonstrations, riots, then beginning to be divisions within the Communist Party at the higher levels and so on. I mean, I don't think this is at all likely. I'm not saying it will never happen, but in the next 10 years, 20 years, I think it's very, very unlikely. But the consequences, not only for China, but the world of this happening would be very, very serious.
Okay.
All right. I agree with Martin on that, by the way. I think we all want to see China succeed. I hope we all want to see India succeed, and for comparable reasons. You don't want to see these big countries failing their people and thereby failing the world, because instability will be chaotic. But my argument, going back to the very first question, that video they asked, is why can't the two countries cooperate much more? I would like to see that blessed border issue settled, because it's an unnecessary irritant.
Now that she has consolidated more power, do you see that? Do you see the prospects of that happening? Improving now?
I think it can. I mean, it would require some new thinking on both sides. The Indian government surprised many when it announced last year during Prime Minister Modi's visit to China that it would now lift the existing political restrictions on Chinese investment. There were certain sensitive sectors of a strategic nature where Chinese investment was barred, ports, telecoms, and so on, and the government has opened up and said, come in, no problem. China hasn't yet taken that significantly. There are no major new projects announced. But if that happens, that could give China an important stake in the Indian economy. And of course, both countries a stake in each other's well-being. But secondly, I mean, we were just talking off stage, as it were, about this string of pearls theory and so on. I've been quite unwilling to be seduced by any arguments of some fundamental Chinese desire to strangulate India. First of all, like that old line in World War II about the chicken's neck, and the guy said, some chicken, some neck. The Indian neck is not going to be strangled so easily by Chinese pearls scattered across the Indian Ocean, I assure you. But I don't think the Chinese believe they can do it or would want to do it. And if you look, for example, at the Indian Ocean specifically, we actually have completely compatible interests. We both want to see the sea lanes of communication kept open in both directions, from the Gulf and East Africa to India and on past us through the Straits and into China, into the South China Sea, and of course in reverse. That flow of traffic helps India, India's growth, Indian goods, Indian oil security, energy security, that works, and it helps China too. Why would it be in China's interest to interdict shipping in the Arabian Sea? It would actually hurt China. And the same with India. So I don't see why we can't say. I would have liked to see, for example, joint patrols against Somali pirates. Wouldn't it be wonderful if the Indian and Chinese navies, instead of doing war games or exercises, worrying about each other, attacking each other, could actually cooperate in a shared interest? I think we now need to start thinking out of the box in both countries. Cooperation is possible. On global issues, we have comparable stakes in the preservation of the global commons. India has been ahead of China in its active involvement in the UN and multilateral institutions. China is catching up very well. And I think there's a lot that they can do together without necessarily seeing a competition. India supported China on the realignment of the Bretton Woods weighted voting numbers. We felt it was absurd that China should have the same weighted vote as Belgium. You know, this is something we are willing to make common cause with China on. Equally, it seems to me that we can't make common cause on something like cybersecurity. China is still a communist system with a top-down system. Ours is a democracy. We believe in a multi-stakeholder internet. So we're not going to be agreeing on every issue, but there are common issues on which we can cooperate. And I don't believe that this needs to be a conflict or a competition all the time.
Okay, fair enough. Let's open it up to the floor. Questions, anybody? Just raise your hands. A microphone will come to you. Just please introduce yourself. Tell us who you are and where you're from or who you represent. It's got to be at least a couple. Come on, don't be shy.
You're doing such a good job with the questions. I want to leave it to you.
Hardly. Come on, let's have some fun. No questions? I don't believe it. Not even one?
We haven't
All
been
you have to do
enough,
is,
Martin.
This is how people used to interact, you know, pre-internet.
They're the questions
if anybody
over there.
remembers. Anyway,
Right.
okay, I tell you what. We do actually have a lot of questions coming in on this iPad here, so let's get to at least some of them. And this one would probably be for Martin here. How can China be number one? And I like this one because we talk about it every day. If the moment the average Chinese becomes rich and successful, they send their children and capital overseas. This is somewhat less true about India, although a similar phenomenon exists there as well. This is understandably so from Anonymous.
Well,
Not the hacking group, but anyway, yeah.
The phenomenon is clearly true up to a point. And it attracts a lot of attention. I'd be cautious about what proportion of people do this. Certainly, when it comes to education, the better off Chinese quite like sending their kids to university in the US and the UK, and now some European countries as well, but there's more of a language problem for that. Why do they do that? Well, I think that they think it'll give their kids an advantage, although still, of course, the great competition in China is to get to the top universities like Tsinghua, Peking, Fudan University, and so on.
Doesn't it say, though, that they don't rate their own system, they don't believe in it, they don't trust their own system? And
No,
so
I
how
think
can China be number one?
Look, I think it's if you can do it, and the kids want to do it, and they feel it's going to advance their interests, then why not? Is probably the attitude. Let's be honest about it. My son has just got a place at Stanford in the States. Why isn't he going to a UK university? Well, actually, he was the driver of this, not me. But it's an international phenomenon, and the Chinese, as they integrate with the world, will display some of the characteristics that we see in the West. In terms of their capital, well, clearly there are some Chinese who get it out because they are worried about arbitrary regulations and so on being introduced by the government, and they think that if they put the money abroad, it's going to be safer. But it's still a fairly limited phenomenon, but it could become bigger. It could become bigger.
All right, I've been told in very large type that there is a question in the back of the room. So if you could raise your hand and let us know where you are. I can't see it just yet. Am I misinformed? There. Please, sir. Or yes. Please go ahead.
This question is for Dr. Shashi. Sir, what is your assessment of Mr. Modi's government so far?
You
Can
mean
I
in
have your
relation to
answer as
China?
a professional?
Do you mean in relation to China or in relation to...
in general.
In general. Okay, well, it's probably beside the point here, but very simply, I think Mr. Modi has delivered a series of very impressive speeches, but they haven't been accompanied by sufficiently credible action on the ground. And in other words, there's a good diagnosis of what ails India and a lot of energy behind depicting that. We still need to see transformational actions by the government that would put India on the right path. Despite that, India is the largest, fastest growing major economy in the world. So the fundamentals are there, but the things the government can do to make that much better and improve it, that the government hasn't yet done.
Okay. Any other questions from the floor? If not, there is one here that is screaming to be asked. This is, okay, someone who has identified himself, David Chu, and this one would be for you, Martin, as well. And I like this. Can China rule, basically deliver what you're saying will happen in your book, can China rule without the RMB, the Chinese currency, being the dominant currency of trade and financial exchange? Is that almost a given? It has to happen if China is going to rule.
Well, I think the simple answer is no, that China cannot become the predominant economic power in the world unless it's also the predominant financial power, and that requires the renminbi to be fully convertible, open capital markets, and to be the preferred currency of choice as a reserve currency. That would be necessary, in my view, for that.
How soon do you think?
Well, my view on this is slowly, you know, because I think that the Chinese economy is still, you know, adolescent, ill-balanced, still, you know, as we can see now, this period of reform is going to be very difficult to negotiate. So in that situation, the Chinese need to, for example, maintain significant capital controls. You know, the recent business in the renminbi, and the renminbi has been, as we know, appreciating against the dollar between 2006 and last year, the renminbi appreciated by 20% against the US dollar. But then when people began to get worried that that was coming to an end, there was a minor run on the renminbi, and as a result of that, they had to spend quite a lot of their, what was it, quarter of their currency reserves on holding the value of the renminbi. Waste of money, really, at this stage. What the Chinese should have maintained, I think, more stringent capital controls to prevent that. What they should do, though, is to, in my view, they should allow the currency to float. Probably. That would probably be the best bet. But anyway, they haven't done that yet. But they're still clearly trying to work out how to handle this situation. In the longer run, though, because I think the question is directed in the longer run, the renminbi will become convertible and the renminbi will become the dominant currency.
Okay.
I mean, the Bloomberg figures, by the way, that you quoted, I think are wrong. It says that by 2030, the Chinese economy the Chinese economy and the Indian economy combined will be larger than the twice the size of the American economy. Actually, the figures, the more representative figures, are that the Chinese economy will, on its own will be twice the size of the American economy by 2030. That is only, 16 years, 14, whatever it is, 14 15 years away. By that time, the renminbi will sure be the dominant currency.
That's 14 years away. Nearer term, though, I was going to ask you, Martin, whether you're one of these people who believe there is a big one-off devaluation of the renminbi coming, but actually I'm going to ask Shashi, because, there is very little direct export competition between the two, so would it really matter if we had a big one-off devaluation of the renminbi to India?
Well, at the moment, the terms of trade between India and China are so bad in terms of from India's point of view, there's so much to India's disadvantage. We've had, to begin with, a massive trade imbalance throughout the growth period. Trade's now at about $70 billion, but about 60 billion of that is Chinese goods being sold to India. There's practically nothing the Chinese are buying from India, and that's become a real issue. It's not the value of the renminbi, but much more Chinese disinterest in Indian products. They were buying raw materials when they were growing, almost colonial terms of trade, but now the raw materials are of less interest to them. They don't need iron ore and they don't need coal and they need all these things because they're not manufacturing as much as they used to. And the second problem is the things we do want to sell them, like pharmaceuticals. There are various non-tariff trade barriers that's making it impossible for us to break into the Chinese market.
Because they're protecting their own pharma?
So there are huge frustrations. I mean, for us, the value of the renminbi is the least of our problems. It's about actually being able to sell our goods in China at whatever price is reasonable for the Chinese to pay for them. And at the same time, we haven't been tough on the Chinese goods coming into India, which have wiped out many industries. I mean, a 2,000-year-old Indian industry of natural dyes has been wiped out by Chinese chemical dyes completely. You know, nothing, you can't buy an Indian dye anymore in India. Toys, even our Hindu gods are being manufactured in China now. So, I mean, this is extraordinary. But in turn, they need to lift some barriers and let India into their market as well.
Okay, this
and
question,
that's very important.
Shashi, this question has to be for you as well. This is from David Chu again. Thank you, David. What will it take for India to consistently achieve the kind of economic growth rates China has enjoyed in the last 3-4 decades?
What will it take?
Yeah.
Well, it'll take Indians becoming Chinese, so that's not going to happen. But you know, we have a lot of good things going for us, and amongst the things we have going for us are the entrepreneurial spirit of the Indian people. There's an old joke that the Indian economy grows at night when the government is asleep. That unlike China, it's not government-led growth, it's entirely private initiative-led growth, and I think that's largely true. We have first-class entrepreneurs who've not only in the diaspora but at home. We have people who have established themselves a tremendous track record of management, world-class companies coming out of India. Not something the Chinese can say yet. There aren't Chinese equivalents to Tata's or Infosys or Wipro or whatever. India has also taken FDI outside, so that, for example, the Tatas have turned around Jaguar Land Rover. They didn't succeed with British Steel, but they did get Jaguar Land Rover into the black, and it's doing very well, and so on and so forth. So there's tremendous energy out there. There's talent. There's a huge domestic market which has been functioning. Domestic consumption's up. I do feel that the fundamentals are there to take India forward. I don't think we're going to grow at 10% as China did, but I think we can sustain 7 to 8% over the next 20 years and get to numbers which are credible. Already in PPP terms, we are the third largest economy in the world. We've overtaken Japan. And in exchange rate terms, we could draw level with the US around 2050 to be second to China. Those are the projections by Goldman Sachs and
that's
others.
not a bad place to be either.
It's
Yeah.
entirely feasible. The challenge is, of course, for us that we have this huge opportunity, which is also potentially a disaster, and that's demography. 65% of our population is under 35, 50.1% under 25. The people who are ready to start work are all in India now. The ILO says that we've got 116 million people between the ages of 20 and 24 in the year 2020. China will only have 94 million at the same time. We could be the dynamic sort of workforce for the world.
Right.
We have to train them, equip them. We have to have an infrastructure and a manufacturing industry to absorb them.
Final thought. Would it be fair to say, unlike, let's say, China, in India, if you're not able to, let's say, maximize this demographic dividend, right? You have a lot of people without jobs. The government cannot deliver. The difference with China is you will not have so much a revolution, you'll just have a different government.
Yeah, we just keep changing governments and elections. Though, in fact, right now we have a government with a secure majority for 5 years. Would have been a great opportunity to do more than they have done. They've allowed themselves to answer that question more fully, to be distracted by unnecessary issues, cultural issues of religious chauvinism and so on, which have needlessly distracted the government and the nation from the real agenda of economic growth and transformation, where they would have found people willing to back them across the spectrum. That's one thing where the Chinese system, because of its rather rigorous control, has been able to avoid. There has been a single-minded focus on getting rich. And I think that is the real answer to your question. That's what it would take to make India grow like China, is if we can focus single-mindedly on getting rich.
Oh, okay. I think many people would agree with
we're
you
not capable
on that. Now, I'm going to get spanked by our Credit Suisse minders, but I'm really just too tempted. I have to ask this question. This is from, let's see here, Raj Chitrani. And I assume this would be for Shashi, although Martin can have a crack at this too. Raj is asking, to what extent do caste and communal differences hinder India from realizing its true potential? Does the fact that China is culturally more homogenous than India give China a very strong edge? Shashi, first go.
Well, yes, we have all these differences, but the great strength of India has been, it's been an outstanding example of the management of diversity in the developing world. Fact is, many societies have that diversity. As I said, the Africans look at us and they see many similarities. The question is, how do you manage that? Is it always going to be a source of conflict? When conflict erupts, are you able to diffuse the conflict effectively? And through our democracy and our system, we have been able to do that. I think one of the great unsung accomplishments of 70 years of Indian democracy, look back at articles in the 1950s and 60s predicting India's imminent disintegration. The London Times and places like that, Neville Maxwell, a big China fan, wrote articles saying this is going to be India's last election, he wrote in 1967. Well, there have been a dozen more since. The fact is that people didn't see how India would hang together, but India managed the difficult art of saying you can be divided by caste, creed, color, culture, conviction, cuisine, custom, and costume, and still rally around a consensus. And that consensus in a democracy like India is on the fundamental principle, which China doesn't have, that you don't need to agree all the time, so long as you agree on the ground rules of how you will disagree. So our success is that we manage to maintain consensus on how to manage without consensus. Can China do that the day the consensus disappears?
You see,
Can it?
I think China is a fascinating country in this sense. There it is, a fifth of the world's population. The longest continuous existing policy in the world, as I mentioned earlier. And if you look at the map, what happened to all the old empires? All the old empires have disappeared. And there's China, which started off as an empire, and it's still there. Now, how is it still there? What's the key? I think there is one key factor behind the fact that China still enjoys this sort of cohesion.
It is?
It is that China consisted of a multitude, historically, of many different races and ethnicities. And yet, over time, the process of Hanization, that is, people regarding themselves to be Han, which has become not quite but almost synonymous with being Chinese, was a remarkably successful process. It's taken 2,000 years. But if you look at the population surveys now, over 94% of Chinese think of themselves as Han. That is an extraordinary fact. And I think that underlying China's, the fact that the centripetal forces that hold China together are generally, but not always, stronger than the centrifugal forces, is for this reason.
How concerned are you about this? The opposite of that is, I was going to bring up, say, Muslims in Xinjiang, Tibetans.
But look, you see, yeah, of course there's a problem. But look, the fact is that there are 20 million people in Xinjiang province, which is a huge, geographically huge, but largely uninhabitable. 10 million of them are Uyghur, are Muslim. Just 10 million people. Or if you look at Tibet, what's the population of Tibet? Under 5-6 million? Plus the people who live in Sichuan and so on. They're very small relative to the total population of China. I'm not getting involved in, do the Chinese handle these problems rightly? In many ways, I don't think they do.
Okay.
But they are tiny compared with what we're talking about, which is 1.4 billion people. And this is the key to understanding China.
Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I've got all three screens here screaming at me to wrap up. I wish we had more time. This is very interesting, exciting.